Seriously?
Hey guys, and welcome to this tactics video with me, 6+ Stevo. Now in this tactics video, I'm going to be covering deployment. And before we get into some of the tactics and things that I'm going to be going over, I want to just say a disclaimer at the beginning of this video. This is in no way designed to be the definitive tactics video on deployment and how it's going to get you to win games and things. This is purely just some ideas, some things you can try, some tactics and setup and things that I use, and tricks and tips and stuff that I deploy in my deployment. And the reason for that is because deployment, it covers such a huge range of different things. There's so many different nuances and different facets and things of it you can explore, and tricks you can use, and you know the rules are constantly changing in regards to deployment. Only recently we've had the latest edition of chapter approved and the new missions completely revamping and changing the way we deploy. And some of us use the missions from the rulebook, some of us use the missions from the 2017 chapter approved, from the 2018 chapter approved, which is really changed the way we deploy. And of course all the campaign books and things as well, whether we're playing narrative missions and match play missions, and there's just so many different variables in this that it's going to be insanely hard to try and cover everything in one video. So like I say, this is just going to be sharing with you a few ideas and a few tricks and things that I use in deployment and what I've found to be fairly effective. And I've deployed wrong in many games and it has cost me the game. Deployment really is quite kind of a key part of the game. If you get your deployment wrong at the beginning of the game, you are facing an uphill struggle for the rest of the game, and it can be very hard to sort of correct that. So I've made a lot of mistakes and learned from those mistakes over the years in playing the game. And yeah, so like I say, this is just going to be a few ideas and a few different things you can try. In the future, I will probably revisit this and do a part 2 and maybe even a part 3, and you know, come back with future tactics videos on deployment. And yeah, because like I say, there is just too much to cover and try and cover. So where do we start with it? This has been a tough one for me. Usually I do tactics videos involving a particular unit and I can talk about that unit in detail and cover everything. With deployment, it's a lot harder. It's a lot trickier to sort of know where to even start this video. But with that said, let's just get stuck into it. The first thing I will say is plan your deployment before the match. And what I mean by that is before you even arrive at your gaming club or around your friend's house, or friends come to your house or whatever, once you've created your army list, visualize it in your head. Perhaps even get the army out, lay it out on the coffee table and lay out how you see it being deployed, and make a plan. Now, this plan isn't going to stay intact because of various different things, different deployment zones, different terrain setups. You don't know what mission you're going to be playing, etc, etc. So you're not going to stick to this plan, but it is important to have a plan to start with. Now, the reason you make the plan is because you're kind of getting an idea, a feel for your army, laying it out on the table and looking at it and seeing how all the different units interact with each other. You know, what is your key units? What units are you intending to sort of win you the game? What units are your chaff units? What units are you going to be using for objective grabbing? What units need to sort of be near each other and things to buff each other and stuff? You've got to have this sort of idea and plan in your head before you go into the game. If you go in there with no plan at all, you're kind of just making it up as you go along, and that's when you can make some silly mistakes, especially if you're on a bit of a time frame for the game. If you're playing in a tournament setting, certainly you're going to be on some tight time restrictions, and when you push for time and you're just getting the stuff laid out on the table as quick as you can with no real thought or planning, you're going to run into some pitfalls. So have a plan beforehand. Lay your army out. Think of the ideal setup scenario for your army, but be ready to adapt. Be ready to tweak it and adapt it. So you're not going to be able to set it up in the exact way you've intended to, because like I say, you may have set it all up, the scenery may be really tight, you might be fighting on a city fight board with dense buildings and terrain and lots of cover and things, and so it might be really tricky to set it up in the way that you intended, but you can adapt, you can tweak certain elements of it. You think, right, well, I can't quite get that where I want it to be, there's not enough room on the table because of blocking scenery, etc., etc. But at least you've got a plan that you can tweak and adapt, and you've thought about it. You've given it some thought pre-game. That's first tip I would give, just to have a plan to start with, and be ready to adapt it. You know, it's not set in stone, but it's giving you some ideas. It's giving you a feel for your army and a way to tweak that and change that slightly, depending on the scenario, depending on the mission, depending on the terrain. But at least you're coming at it with some kind of plan. Plans are just there, they are just that, they're plans. Plans can change, but it's better to change an existing plan and tweak it than have no plan at all. Think about your aura abilities. HQs, a big one for this, and various other units and things have aura abilities. But certainly with the Orks, we've got to think about your war boss with his wire ability, your big mech, you know, especially if he's got a custom force field, your pain boys, your weird boys, etc. Really think about those aura abilities and think about where you want them and what you want those auras to buff. So for example, your war boss, you're not going to want to deploy him across the board or hidden behind cover, stuck somewhere where he's going to find it difficult to get within range of your slugger boys or your knobs, for example. Something that he's going to want to buff to be able to get them into combat quicker. Your big mech with this custom force field, you're going to want him near vehicles. I'm sorry if this sounds very basic stuff, but this is all stuff that you want to think about. Your weird boy, think about the psychic powers he's going to be using. Is he going to be using to jump? In which case, does he want to be near the unit that you're intending to jump across the board? You've got to really, really think about those aura abilities. So when you're deploying your units, think about, is there enough space? You know, I'm deploying the big mech here. This is a good spot to put him. Do I have enough space on the board to be able to, you know, put my battle wagon there or put my death dreads there that he's going to be protecting and buffing and repairing during the game? You've really got to plan that out. And this goes back to my first point, in laying your army out, trying things out, just having a look at it. It's all very well and good visualizing it in your head and talking about it and things and writing it down on paper. But yeah, really laying them out on the table, you can really get a feel and see, you know, how things connect with each other. Because in gaming, in tactics, I've talked about this before, but it's not just about the powerful units and your list building, it's about synchronizing these units, getting these units to work together and buff each other, protect each other, using one unit to distract from another unit, etc., etc. And in talking about terrain and things, this can be really difficult for us Ork players, especially if we are running the Green Tide army. Those goth players out there especially who like to run huge mobs of 30 slugger boys, you know, several mobs of these, and just swamp the table with loads of grots and loads of boys and just swamp the enemy with numbers. It can be really difficult getting all of these units onto the table, depending what size table you're playing and what size game you're playing. If you're playing on a 6x4, it's not usually too much of a struggle unless you're playing a really large points game. But sometimes a 4x4 table can be a real struggle to squeeze them all on. I've had several games where I've just really had to just cram everything on, and you end up with very little choice about where to put stuff because there is not really any choice. There's one little spot of the table available for that one unit, and that's the only place you can put it, and it might not be ideal. So this can be a real struggle for us. So how do we get around this? Well, the short answer is we can't always get around it. It's just going to be, if you're running a horde army, it's just the price you have to pay. And sometimes you're going to have to deploy in ways that you don't really want to because of the terrain and the space on the board. And you are just forced into doing that. And that's just something you're going to have to live with. But there are some little tricks and tips and ways to be able to help you with that. First off, you can use transports. So if your army includes battle wagons, trucks, even things like Gorkanauts, Stompers, etc., you can fit units into these transports. This will help you then in only deploying one unit rather than 2 units. Or if you've got spare space in that transport, you can fit in your HQs. So say you've got a battle wagon and you've put a squad of 12 boys in there. I'm just throwing an example out there. And that battle wagon's got enough space to carry 20. Well, why waste that transport capacity? You can fit in your weird boy in there. You can chuck in your big mech in there, chuck your war boss in there. Now, in deploying one unit, you have effectively deployed 4, maybe even 5 units at once. And this can be really handy if you're playing the missions from the rulebook or the 2017 edition of Chapter Approved. So what I mean by that is when deployment in those missions is done on a turn-based scenario. So you deploy 1 unit, your opponent deploys 1 unit, and you alternate back and forward until everything is deployed. And in those missions, the person who finishes setting up first will essentially get first turn, or at least will get a big advantage or a +1 to their dice roll for who gets first turn. So if you really want first turn, this is a great strategy to use your transports to minimise the amount of units you've got. Because most of the time, if you're an Ork player and you're facing off against Space Marines or Necrons or Chaos, or to be honest, most armies, you're going to usually outnumber them in terms of the amount of units, which is going to put you at a disadvantage for getting first turn. And if you really want first turn, then this is a great strategy to use to include multiple units in a transport. That transport then just counts, with everything inside it, counts as 1 unit being deployed. So this can be a really good little trick to minimising the amount of units you deploy on the table, saving you some space and going some way to perhaps increasing your chances of getting first turn. Of course, all of that is completely irrelevant if you're playing the new missions from the Chapter Approved, in which one person deploys their entire army and then you deploy your entire army. Tips for those missions. I would say, depending who wins the roll-off and who's setting up their army first. So in those missions, whoever sets up their army first gets the first turn automatically. So this has got pros and cons in these new missions, both ways. So if you're setting up first, obviously you've got the disadvantage of not knowing where your opponent's going to deploy. He can deploy reactively, so he can see where you've deployed your units and then deploy his army accordingly. So that puts you at a big disadvantage. That is balanced by the fact that you're probably going to get first turn unless he can seize the initiative. What I would say in those scenarios is deploy your army with the assumption that you're going to get first turn. Now, this is risky because if you're going to essentially, if you're an assault army, you're going to deploy as far forward as you can. You're not going to be worrying about cover and stuff too much because as far as you're concerned, you're getting first turn. You're going to want to deploy as far forward as you can to be able to get into combat early, do as much damage as you can in that first turn. Of course, if your opponent rolls the dreaded 6 and steals the initiative and gets first turn, then it's screwed your plans. But there is nothing you can do about that, and the odds of that are 1 in 6. So you've got a 5 in 6 chance that that's not going to happen. And so I would say, personally, take those odds. 40k is a game about playing the odds. Using the statistics and things and the odds and trying to get the odds in your favour. And, the math hammer doesn't always work how we intend and stuff, but I would certainly say to do that. Now, if you're the person deploying second, obviously your tactics changes completely. You need to now deploy with the assumption that you are not going first, that you will not steal the initiative. Of of course there is that chance that you do steal the initiative, but again, it's playing the odds. You've got a 1 in 6 chance that you're going to go first. You've got a 5 in 6 chance that you're not going first. So play the odds. Assume that you're not going to get first turn and deploy everything in as much cover as you can. Get behind line of sight blocking terrain and get everything covered and safe as possible. You would really want to restrict your opponent's options. So when he gets first turn, he's going to have a real hard time moving and getting into positions where he can shoot you, especially if he's got static gun units and stuff, which he ideally doesn't want to be moving. If you give him very few targets, then actually he can almost have a wasted turn. His first turn can be a real struggle for him to be able to do anything of any real significance, giving you the second turn to come out from behind cover and hit him hard. So yeah, there's a few tips there in terms of the different sort of deployments and things, with the new ways that 40k keeps tweaking and balancing this stuff. If we're going back to 2017 chapter approve and rulebook missions and things, another little trick: if you're doing this turn by turn deployment, always set up your reserve units first. So when you're taking turns, you're setting up a unit, your opponent's setting up a unit. If you know that you're going to be using the teleport stratagem, if you've got some units like Defcopters, for example, things like that you know you're holding off in reserve, don't set them up last. Set them up first, because that still counts as setting up a unit. And because you're taking turns in deploying these units, you're reacting to what each other are doing. Your opponent deploys a tank right in the sort of far right side of the board. You think, right, I need to target that tank. So you start looking at your tank killing units, maybe your met guns, maybe your looters, maybe your tank busters, etc., etc. So you deploy them, so they're going to have good line of sight to it, they're going to be in range of it, etc. In the early stages of the game, you want to restrict your opponent being able to react to where you're deploying stuff. So for me, for example, I quite often have multiple units of Defcopters in reserve. I'll have quite often my Gorkanaut or my Def Dreads on a teleport pad. I will always, without fail, set those units up first. So my opponent deploys one of his units, and then I'll say, right, my Gorkanaut is on a teleport pad, so he's in reserve. He then has to set up another unit. Then it's my turn again. Okay, this unit of 2 Defcopters is in reserve. He then has to deploy another unit. Okay, this second unit of Defcopters is in reserve. He has to then set up another unit. He's now set up like 3, maybe 4 units before I've set up anything. At this point, he's exposing his plans. He's got his units there, looking vulnerable. I know where they are. I know I can get an idea of what he's going to attempt to do. I can see what range they're at. I know, the advantage is fully with you at that point. He has no idea what you're doing. And it's put him in a really tough position of thinking about where he's going to deploy stuff. Because he doesn't know where you're going to put your met guns yet. He doesn't know where your tank busters are going to go. He doesn't know where your war boss and your big horde of boys are going to go. And it really puts the advantage in your court. It's such a simple thing, but you'll be amazed at how many opponents and players don't use that to their advantage, and they will set up their army, and then at the end they'll say, oh yeah, these units are in reserve. They've wasted that opportunity. It's such a powerful tactical tool to use to set up your reserves first. Obviously, I cover this is pretty obvious, and I feel like I'm teaching you how to suck eggs, but obviously use cover to your maximum advantage. Think about the units that you want in cover. In buildings, at height, giving them good range of visibility. Obviously things like looters are ideal unit. Static units you're going to want in cover. So looters are a prime candidate for this. You're probably not intending them to do much moving in the game, certainly not in the early stages. So make sure they use the cover. It's not going to be much point getting a unit of boys behind cover. If they're a large unit, you're probably not going to be able to benefit from that cover because they're too big a squad anyway. But yeah, get things like looters in cover in good positions where they've got hopefully good height so they can see over other bits of terrain and a good range of the board. vehicles and things, if they're key vehicles, especially if you've loaded them up, as I said earlier, with a lot of expensive units and key stuff, get them behind, line of sight blocking cover. If you've got a large building or a big mountain or whatever, stick your truck loaded up with some expensive stuff behind that, so you know that your opponent first turn has got no chance of being able to hit it, because obviously loading it up with a lot of stuff is going to make it a big bullet magnet, so you're going to want that kept out of cover. And what you can do in first turn with those trucks loaded with various characters and stuff, what you can do in first turn is get those characters out of the vehicle in the movement phase. They're going to suffer no penalty or anything. It just means you've been able to set up one unit with them in. So first turn they can hop straight out before the truck moves and go off and do their thing. So it's not going to cause much hindrance. The only risk is that that truck gets destroyed and you run the risk of you losing a lot of powerful stuff. But if you deploy behind cover, those risks should be minimal. So yeah, think about your static shooty units. Things like met guns, you're going to want them. Met guns can be tricky because depending on what guns you use, I for example use custom mega blasters on mine. They've got the shortest range of all the met guns, so I tend to have to deploy them usually fairly central and as far forward as possible, because I want them to be able to cover as much of the board as possible with their threat range. I want my opponent to think about moving out into the open, into no man's land, knowing that these met guns can be targeting his big vehicles and expensive stuff, and have him to pause and think twice about where he's going to go. Think about your static units, because preferably things like met guns, things like looters, you don't usually want to be moving those units at any point. If you're having to move them, then you've probably deployed them wrong, or something's gone wrong in the game somewhere along the lines. So those units, either set them up first into areas where you want them so you don't take that air space up with other units, or keep an area of the board kept clear. That building that is ideal to house your looters in, don't lose sight of that, and when you're setting up units, set up a unit of grots in this, and then you've spoilt it and not been able to use it for your looters. The other thing we can do with these horde armies in trying to squeeze our army onto the table and into the deployment zone is pack them tight. We don't have to worry about blast markers anymore. Blast markers are a thing of the past. So no longer do we need to space everything out exactly 2 inches apart so we can minimise the damage coming in from blast markers. I know the amount of people that lament the loss of blast markers and pray that they'd come back, and I can see that to an extent. They were fun and fluffy in a lot of ways, but it has sped up the game, and it has reduced a level of beardiness in certain players in the game. Now we don't need to worry about that. So pack your units tight, get really tight, get bases touching each other, pack them in really tight, because you want to keep as much of that space of the board open to be able to deploy your stuff as possible. Now that's if I'm talking there if you're running a horde army. If you're running a more elite army and you've got the luxury of space on the board, then you might want to spread them out, and in which case I would say spreading them out is a big plus, because you want to be thinking about reserves popping up and deep striking units. You want to have an area of denial. So you don't want to pack them too tight and leave a big gaping hole at the rear of your deployment zone, leaving it just perfect for your opponent to deep strike in and then cause carnage in your back line. So you've really got to think about that. So that depends on the type of army you're using, whether you're using a horde army or a more elite army. But yeah, there you go, guys. That's just a few tips and tricks and things that I use, and a few ideas to think about. These tactics videos I do, I don't play in tournaments. I'm not smashing opponents left, right, and centre. I'm not, I don't have any right to give tactical tips and things and guarantee that if you use these, you will win games. These are just tricks and things that have worked for me. Ideas that I find useful, tactics that I find useful, and hopefully if you guys can get something out of this, and if this video has helped you in any way of your deployment, then I would love to hear from you. And please share in the comments section. Share in the comments section any tips you have in terms of deployment, and in terms of where you deploy your units, how you deploy your units, and how you deploy and how you adapt your tactics with this ever-changing game that we call 40k 8th edition, because it's constantly on the change and the move. And yeah, this has been quite a tricky video to get together actually, and just sort of I was thinking about it for some time. How do I come at this? What angle do I come at this from? And do I cover the different types of missions? Do I do it mission specific? Do I do it deployment specific in terms of what edition of chapter approved, or whether I go with the rulebook? So in the end, I just went with writing some of the tips and tricks and ideas that I use, and just throwing them out there to you guys. And hopefully some of it's been useful to you guys. But guys, if you enjoyed this tactics video, please hit that like button and hit that subscribe button, because check out the tactics playlist. So I've got tactics on all sorts of things, and there's many more tactics videos coming up in the future, as well as loads of other Orky content on this channel. And like I said guys, share your tips and tricks and ideas down below, and I'll see you on the next one guys. This is 6 Stevo signing out.